Yeah, hey, yeah, hey, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, let's do some watercolor painting. So this is our reference photo. This is my friend's parents' house. He commissioned me to do this painting. It's going to be a Christmas present for his parents, so we don't want to make this anything weird. We want to make this painting something that someone's mom would like. We're going to be painting this on arches. Only use arches, 140-pound cold-pressed paper with Winsor & Newton Cotman paints, which suck, but it would cost like $150 to replace all my paints. I've made 2 drafts of this painting already. This is the first one. It really sucks. The colors are wrong. I made a lot of mistakes, so there's a lot of lifting, and there's really no depth. But I knew this was going to be a first draft, so I didn't really care.
Painting failed.
This is the second draft. I actually really like this one. The colors are a lot better. I made less mistakes. This would have been the final draft, but I messed up the video. My head was in it, just covering the painting the entire time, so we're just going to make a new one.
Painting failed.
When I was in the 3rd grade, my teacher would have my class do multiplication table tests every morning. These tests were timed where we had about 3 minutes to do something like 30 problems, and my teacher would project a timer on the board while we did the tests. I would walk to school back then, and one day it was so cold outside that I could not feel my hands after getting to school. When the test started, I tried my best to write, but my hands wouldn't move. The stress of my hands being so cold and the timer on the board was too much for me, and I just mentally shut down. My teacher saw this and came up to me and started yelling, "What's going on? You're not writing anything. Time's running out." And I got so upset that I just started yelling, "Stop! Stop! Stop!" I get the exact same feeling when I'm doing my watercolor washes. I used to get super mad when doing my washes, but I realized we could redo this as many times as we want. It does not matter. I do not care. You gotta just have a stoic mindset when doing this and just don't freak out and just restart if you screw up. So to paint this sky, I'm doing a wet on dry gradient wash with a mix of cerulean and ultramarine. And to make a gradient like this, you want to start at the top with more pigment and then lighten your paint as you go down. But over the first pass, I didn't have much of a gradient, so I added more pigment at the top and then kind of blended it using a brush with only water. And it's important to get the right amount of water in your brush when blending it. You don't want to put too much water because that will bleed out and ruin the wash. When you're doing washes, you want to remove the excess water that pools up just so it doesn't flow back into the wash and ruin it. So you could just remove it with a paper towel. And then I blend it one more time just to make it super smooth. Once I'm done blending, I take the board and I put it on a slope facing upside down so the paint starts running towards the top of the sky, and that's how we're going to keep our gradient. I didn't do this with my second draft painting, so the wash kind of ended up looking a little flat. After the wash dries, I remove the tape that was protecting the roof of the house, and I draw the rest of the drawing. I save the drawing until after the wash in case I have to restart. I don't waste as much time drawing. And then with all paintings, we're going to start off with the lightest areas. I use some raw sienna for the highlights on the house and on those tiles by the pool. And for the walls of the house, I add a little bit of crimson to make a nice peachy color. And as I'm painting the wall, I add some blue to our mixture just to give some variation, make it a little bit more purple in some areas. So I took this photo about 30 minutes before sunset, and it doesn't really look like that. The shadows are long, but I'm going to make things a little bit more red and more purple just to emphasize the kind of late evening feeling of this painting. I drop in some ultramarine there to create that shadow. I think the just straight ultramarine with this kind of peachy color looks really good. And I forgot to draw those pots, so I just draw them in there. Since these tiles are closer to us than the house is, we want to make them a little bit more warm. And what that does is it kind of brings them forward and it creates a sense of depth. So you could warm up that color by adding some raw sienna. And then I drop in some ultramarine just to give some texture. And I do the same thing with warmth while I'm painting this patio. I try to keep it cooler in the background, then I add some crimson to warm it up as it comes towards the foreground. Then add some purple because it gets kind of cool there. And I lift the tiles there because I like the color of the patio more and I want to kind of match that. And we're just going to continue painting the rest of our lighter tones. I drove an hour away from my house to take this photo, and on my drive back, my car overheated and melted the sensors and the thermostat, and the coolant had to be, replaced, I guess. And that cost me $700. So this painting is at least worth $700. So to paint this palm that's in the foreground, if you look at it really closely, it's a super complex, complicated looking plant. But how we're going to paint this is we're going to keep it simple. I just squint my eyes and then I see the vague shapes and I paint those shapes. You don't want to make it too complicated. You'll ruin the painting. And then to paint the back portion of the patio, I initially painted it too warm. So we're going to cool that down with some ultramarine. Make it a little bit more purple than the front of the patio. And when I'm painting around the table and chairs, I want to leave a little bit of white space for the chair and the table, just to leave some highlights for those areas when I paint them in the future. And then I continue painting the plant. I add a little bit of cerulean blue to kind of mix up the greens. And I just really try to remember to paint very simple shapes, but you want to get those shapes looking correct. So they're simple, but you want to make them right. I'm going to paint the grass the exact same way that I painted the patio, with a really nice cool green in the background, and then warm it up as we come into the foreground. I added a bit too much pigment there, so I lifted it. And that looks sweet. And then I dab some areas just to keep some highlights. And that's kind of all of the lighter tones in our painting. So we're going to start moving into mid-tones. And I'm going to use that same grass color on this plant to kind of add some more detail, a little bit more three-dimensionality. And this is where you got to start being bold. You want to do strong, confident brushstrokes. With the hedges in the background, I want to keep them super simple since they're further away. Just really simple shapes with one color for the highlight. There's some succulents under the palm. They're closer to the foreground, but they're right on the edge of the painting, and I don't want to draw any attention there. So I'm going to keep them very simple as well. So there's a few super important parts of this painting, and probably the second most important part is the roof And I am not painting in those solar panels because I hate the way solar panels look. The roof's important because it's really going to be a big block of really similar colors and it's going to stand out. So we want to get these colors correct. There's a highlight on the right side of each roof, kind of where the tiles come up and the sun hits them. And I'm going to make the right portion of the roof more warm just because I want to emphasize that as the centerpiece of our painting. So for these windows, I'm going to put a really nice cool blue color, and this is going to be the color of the window frames. It makes it a lot easier to paint windows if you layer them. You don't want to paint each frame as like a small line and then paint the panes around that. You just want to paint the entire block of color and then the panes on top. And I make the color really blue because that area is going to be super dark and in shade. There's an area on the sliding doors there that is actually getting hit by the sun through an arch on the left. So we want to keep that area that really nice raw sienna highlight color. And now I am painting the main body of the roof. And this is a super important part of the painting. So I really want to have a nice, bold color. I want to be bold here. And I add a lot more red than the photo. I think that looks better. And it matches the evening look of the painting. I keep a little white line there in the roof just to create a little bit of visual interest, like a highlight where the sun is hitting the tiles. And for the section of the roof that's in the background, we want to add a little bit of blue to cool it down, make it a little bit more purple so it falls back. We really want that front section on the right to pop. And on the left section of the roof, I cool it down even more. You could even tell in the photo, that section of the roof seems a lot cooler than the other two parts. Seems like the sun isn't hitting it as directly. So for the pool, I've never really painted anything like this before, but by just looking at the photo, I could tell that the lighter parts of the house, like the pillars, the color of the reflection pretty much matches the actual color. And as things get further back, they get really blue shifted and get a blue tint. So that's how we'll paint the pool. I really like the color of this window in the photo. It has a really nice sage green color, so I'll make sure that carries over into the painting. I forgot to add the kind of shadow of the plant on that pillar in the reflection, so I'm just going to redo that entire section so I could do it correctly. So for the shadow of the bush on the wall of the house there, this is actually the part of the painting I struggled the most with. On my first draft, I must have done it 20 times, just lifting over and over again. And I tried to keep it simple at first, but it just looked like a blue blob. So with shadows like this, I think it's best to really try to make them elegant and delicate, just with your brush strokes. Make it a little bit more detailed. Blue and orange are complementary colors, so the kind of peachy color of the wall and the ultramarine blue of the shadow really complement each other. That's probably my favorite part of the painting. I liked how that turned out, so I just used ultramarine as the shadows on the roof as well. It's been super cold and rainy where I live, so the paint takes forever to dry. And when I painted that shadow on that section of the roof, it started bleeding. So I lifted it and then I tried painting it again because I thought the paper towel would kind of lift the residual moisture, but it did not work, so I just leave it to dry for longer. And after that debacle, I got a little personal heater and I put it in my room so my paint would actually dry. I'm actually freezing to death right now because I can't run the heater while I record. It makes too much noise. The closest I've been to dying was actually freezing to death on a camping trip I went on one time. I stopped camping after that. For the house's gutter, it has the same kind of level of saturation as the roof does, but it's a slightly browner color, so we want to get the pigment saturation right. And we succeed. And I continue with making all the colors on that left section of the roof slightly cooler. I forgot to paint the highlighted part of the pillars in the reflection, so I paint that now. And the paper is finally dried enough to where I could paint that shadow on the roof. You know, while I was painting this painting, I took a break for about a day, and it rained extremely hard. A giant storm came in, and I left the window of my room open, and everything was so humid that my watercolor paper became floppy, all the paper in my room. It was very odd. And we're continuing painting our midtones. There's a cool blue stone on the side of the pool right before it hits the water, and that is also reflected in the water, so we'll paint that. There's some concrete under the jacuzzi there, and we're going to paint it a really cool gray because that's going to be in shadow. Now this shadow on the roof is a very dramatic part of our painting, so we want to get that right. I just put some ultramarine over the roof, and that creates a nice purple shadow. I kind of said this in my last video, but it's hard to get midtones right. You don't want them to be too dark because then they get muddied up with the rest of your darks. It's easy to do very little pigment and make really light colors, and it's easy to do a lot of pigment to make dark colors, but it's hard to get a good middle ground there for midtones. The part of the window that I'm about to paint, it seems to reflect the sky, but it's much darker gray or blue. So we take some cerulean and just kind of gray it up to paint that. And that will leave a reflection there. We're going to paint black around that so it'll stand out more. And then there's a right section of the house there, and it's pretty much completely in shadow. So we just do a really nice cool gray. It's a different shadow than the rest of the house, which will be more purple, because we want that one to fall really into the background. And in the picture, it's much grayer than the rest of the shadows on the house. For this shaded area of the house I'm painting now, in the photo it's not really blue, it's more kind of a purplish gray. But I painted it here more blue. I think that fits the style of the painting, where we're going for cooler colors in the background, and it fits with the other shadows that I've already painted. Now for the shadow in the archway section of the house, it has more of a warm brown tint to it. You can see that in the photo. I think that's because the sun is still going through those archways, and I think it kind of radiates in there. Makes it more warm. And it's a good way to kind of differentiate that part of the painting, because that's really the centerpiece and we want to bring attention to it. And I could use that same brown color to paint these sides of these chairs here, and that creates some visual continuity. And when I'm painting these pots here, I want to be careful. I don't want to add any detail to them. They're quite in the background, so I'm just going to have them be one single block of color. And the same principle goes for this jacuzzi. We are going to keep it very simple. It's in shadow, so it's not going to have a lot of detail. The shadow here seems a little darker than the shadow on the front facing wall, just by looking at the photo, and a little bit grayer, so I try to accomplish that. I think that wasn't gray enough, so I kind of blended in some more gray brown there. For the section of this wall that's being hit by the sun, the room behind it is dark, but the sun is still hitting that part of that window pane, so we want to make it a little bit of a lighter gray than what the rest of the panes that are in shadow are going to be. The panes that are in shadow are going to be pretty much pure black. I layer on some more gray under the jacuzzi because it has two tones in the photo. I add some detail there and then I'm like, hell no, remove that. The shaded parts of the wall that are reflected in the pool become very gray. So I just gray up the same color that I used to paint the wall and I paint that in the reflection. We're not going to really blue shift anything in the reflection too much until we get to the window panes. It seems like the darker things are, the more they get blue shifted, or the further they get back in the shadow they get blue shifted. I don't know, I'm just seeing what I see in the photo. I'm also going to paint everything slightly simpler in the reflection than the other part of the painting. I think the reflection does muddy things up, and I think adding too much detail there would really complicate the painting and it would look kind of weird. I think doing this makes it look more like a reflection in water instead of some sort of perfect mirror. I'm recording this audio after Christmas. My mom actually framed some of my other paintings as a gift, so thanks, Mom. Shout out, Mom. I have not heard back from my friend on if his parents liked this painting, so maybe they didn't. I got the color wrong on this part of the reflection, so I'm just going to lift it and then let it dry so we could paint it again later. Here's another important part of the painting, this shadow on the ground of the patio. Don't be scared. I got too scared and I messed it up. It was too gray. It needs to be more bold. I tried kind of blending in some blue there to fix it, but it does not work. It's got to be done correctly on the first try. To make it more bold, I make it more blue. And I continue that shadow on the left side of the table. I make sure to leave some white for the chairs. You gotta keep a highlight. There's also some shadows coming from the chairs and the table. You don't really gotta put too much thought into it. It doesn't have to be crazy detail. I just kind of flick in some lines there. I use that same kind of gray, cool shadow color in some other areas. And I'm finally able to paint that part of the reflection because it dried. There's some lights there. I just paint them in with a gray. I make sure not to go too detailed. I just kind of put in some spots of color. And for the shadow of the archway, I just kind of darken the color of the wall a little bit. Paint that. For the fence back there, I just want a really nice, cool gray. I don't really care about that part. It just needs to fall back. This part of the painting is kind of boring. I'm just painting various shades of gray. But that's kind of what it has to be. And here I am painting probably the most important part of the painting. At least it's the most dramatic part. But this shadow, there's a big cypress tree to the left there, casting these shadows. And I want to warm it up, make it a little bit more purple compared to the shadows in the background. So it comes forward, creating that sense of depth that we're going for. And this longer, skinnier shadow as well. If I could paint that one again, it would be at a slightly higher angle. I think it doesn't correctly match the angle of the other shadows. For shadows of plants and things, you just want to keep it natural. Keep some kind of weird brush strokes and some gaps. Now we're getting into our darks. In the shadow of that cypress tree, it's going to be a different color on the patio compared to the grass, so I think we're going to paint the grass. Nope, we're going to paint that bush. Same thing, you don't want to go detailed here. It's super far in the background. I just kind of paint a block of color with some slight variation. You just want to go crazy with your brush strokes. You don't want to make it too artificial looking. And for those little plants, a singular blob is good enough. And I'm not even going to layer color on that. Here I'm kind of using my brush. I'm analyzing the angle of that shadow. I don't really like it, but I'm not going to lift it. Lifting it would make it look worse. And this table and chair set is probably going to be the most detailed part of the painting. It's closer to the foreground and it's quite a complex shape, so we're going to paint that. We don't want it to be too abstract. We want it to look like an actual table and chair here. And I'm going to paint it by just layering grays. So I start with a lighter gray. And I leave the parts hit by the sun just pure white. That adds some nice contrast. Now we are painting the shadows on the grass. Same thing, we're going to start with a cooler shadow in the back and warm it up as we go into the foreground. For a brighter grass like this, I will use a mixture of cadmium yellow and cerulean, and then I could kind of darken it with ultramarine and then gray it if I want to with some burnt sienna, and that's how I create the shadow color. The grass itself could be a little bit more yellow. In the photo, it's really warm and yellow where the sun's hitting it, and I did not really capture that. I think the darks are kind of what saved this painting. It looks a little weird right now. And for our dark areas, we're just going to paint a bluish gray for our windows. Make sure it's a, consistent saturation of color. I'm just using ultramarine and a little bit of Payne's gray just to make it darker. That makes a cool gray. And you gotta make sure to go dark here. This is the darkest part of our painting, so it's gotta be pure dark. Pure evil. And here I'm painting in the window frames. I'm just painting in that dark, cool gray color over the block of blue we painted earlier, and making sure to leave some lines of that blue to act as the window frames. Like there, I didn't leave enough of a line, so I lifted it. I'm just gonna redo it. You really don't gotta overcomplicate windows. They're super simple when they're in the background like this. They don't even have to be perfect rectangles. I don't really care if they're that straight. I just kind of try to make them as rectangular as possible. There's some windows on the right there as well that kind of peek out from behind the pillar, so I just paint little lines. And I make sure not to paint over the palm. I don't even paint up to the yellow of the palm. I leave some white there to act as a reflection off the leaf. To make the darkest parts of our plants in the background, I just add some cadmium yellow and ultramarine to our dark gray color. Make it a little bit more green. The hedges underneath those windows are, if you squint, you only really see one mass of black green. So I'm going to replicate that with a little bit of a highlight of where the sun hits the very tops of those hedges still showing. And that hedge on the very right is pretty much just all dark green. I'm going to speed the video up here. I'm just doing detail work, and it's kind of boring. Just adding the dark parts of specific objects. The shadow that the roofs cast on the wall is super dark, so we want to make sure to go dark enough here. But I think I messed this up. The shadow is much thinner in the photo, and I made them a little too thick. I'll just tell myself it makes it more dramatic. I'm starting to layer on darker grays to the table and chairs. You just want to leave some areas white on complex objects like the chairs, because that just gives the illusion of detail instead of us actually painting any detail. If we tried painting detail on something that small, it would look very strange. With the reflection of the pool, you just want to get the correct amount of detail without getting too complicated. So I do paint in some window frame there, just so the reflection still looks like a window instead of just a singular block of color. But we don't want to care about anything more than that. And for this section of dirt in the front, we just want a really nice warm brown. So the sun is hitting that. Here's where my blue shifting idea comes into play, where I take a really dark gray, but then I add some cerulean to make it more blue. That makes it look a little bit more like a reflection. When I went over to my friend's house to take this photo, his mom was home, and she came out to see what we were doing, and I didn't want to lie to his mom, so I just stood there silent, like an idiot. This kind of succulent plant that I'm painting now is something that I screw up, so I lift it all later. I'm trying to keep it simple because it's on the edge of the painting, but it looks like it's a plant from like Roblox. So we gotta make it a little better. There's a second palm behind the main palm there, so I kind of paint that in, just make it a nice cooler green color, so you can tell it's behind the main palm. I make it a lot more simple than even in the photo. And here's where I kind of just go crazy. I just confident with my brush strokes, and I just kind of feel it out. I'm not really thinking here. With a plant as complicated as this, you just want to have nice, natural, bold brush strokes, so it has the illusion of detail. And I add some more yellow to kind of warm up the areas where the sun is hitting the palm fronds. And then all that's left to really do on that plant is to paint in the super dark areas where there's gaps. Yeah, and that succulent beneath the palm just sucks. It doesn't even look that great in the final painting, but that area is not really important. I think if I redid it, I would paint it like Edward Hopper. I would probably just make it a single mass of really saturated green color. In the photo, it looks really similar to the grass. I probably could have just painted it like that. And with these gaps I'm painting in the dark color, I want to leave them kind of as really sharp shapes because the palm fronds themselves are sharp, so we want to give it a nice sharp look. And then I paint in this shadow. It's not in the photo because I drew the plant a little different. I'm just painting the shadow to kind of place the plant, but I don't think in reality that shadow would be as big and come out as far. And I'm struggling here because I'm really painting things that are not in the reference photo. So I'm trying to just imagine them, which is a little harder. Because I usually try to paint with my eyes instead of my brain. And at this point, it's a lost cause. I'm just going to lift that entire area. And the shapes I paint here are much better, and I think it's a better color too. A little warmer. And I forgot to record that part where I paint that brown shadow color in, so it just appeared. My damn head's getting in the way. And then I sign the painting. Just doing some finishing touches, and then we remove the tape. The best part of watercolor painting.
We make it look easy.
Wow. Look at that. The painting is done. I think this is definitely my best draft out of the 3 I did. I think I captured what I was going for, which is a nice evening sunset scene, and I think this is something that someone's mom would definitely like.
Painting successful.